Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond in for Peter tonight. Well, let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Here's what's coming up on the program. The federal government is leaving one of our most important strategic assets, the Port of Darwin, in the hands of the Chinese after releasing a report that's 4 months old. National security expert Michael Shoebridge will join me. If you thought plain packaging for cigarettes was bad enough, well, now they want to do it to wine. Won't that look good on the dinner table? Adele Young from Alcohol Beverages Australia will talk us through this crazy idea. The Queensland government has joined unis and big banks in offering special leave to people, quote-unquote, mourning the result of the Voice to Parliament referendum. I'll discuss that and more with my panel of Tina McQueen and Christy McSweeney. And just how likely is an interest rate rise on Melbourne Cup Day? Economist Leith Van Onselen will talk about that later in the show. But first, Tasmanian Liberal MP Bridget Archer, or at least she calls herself a Liberal, has launched an extraordinary attack on her leader Peter Dutton, saying that he has weaponised, quote-unquote, the sexual abuse of Indigenous children for political advantage. Ms Archer has for a long time been a Liberal in party membership only. She's constantly criticising the opposition and carrying on like someone who would be much more at home in the Labor Party. Kind of reminds you a bit of Malcolm Turnbull. She crossed the floor this week to vote against the opposition's push for a royal commission into child sexual abuse in Aboriginal communities. Now, Ms Archer is herself a survivor of child sexual abuse, and she said she would likely support a royal commission if it were to investigate abuse everywhere, not just in Indigenous communities. But she ran off to the left-wing Guardian to tell them that Dutton appeared to, quote, weaponise child abuse for, quote, some perceived political advantage. I'll note that she didn't make those comments about Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who also called for this royal commission. I wonder why that might be. But it seems Ms Archer has found allies in more than 100 Indigenous advocacy groups, which today put out a joint statement condemning the idea of a royal commission and accusing the opposition of political point scoring and demonising communities. Ms Archer led the way and they followed. GetUp Chief Executive Larissa Baldwin-Roberts said calls for a royal commission were a quote-unquote despicable attack. These are the same tactics and lies that were weaponised against communities that resulted in the NT intervention, she said. To suggest that something as awful and serious as child sexual abuse has been weaponised and used for perceived political advantage, as Ms Archer did, or a despicable attack, like GetUp said, on Indigenous people, is disgusting. A genuine issue was raised, a real issue that destroys lives, and those raising it are accused of doing so for political advantage by a member of their own team. Ms Archer went on to say that child sexual abuse was a significant issue right across the country. Are there issues in Indigenous communities? Of course, she said. What's needed is action. We could act now. Now, I don't disagree with that. We do need action. And the point of a royal commission is to force that action. But to say that abuse is a significant issue right across the country may be correct, but it minimises the fact that Indigenous children are more likely, far more likely, to be victims of child abuse. Now, new numbers haven't been released for a while, but on the available numbers from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, from 2011 to 2012, Indigenous children were 8 times more likely to suffer any kind of abuse or neglect than non-Indigenous children. The Institute of Health and Welfare also says that rates of sexual assault reported to police in 2012 among Indigenous children aged 0 to 9 in New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia and the Northern Territory, they were 2 to 4 times higher than rates among non-Indigenous children. So clearly child abuse and child sexual abuse are more prevalent in Indigenous communities. Why is that not worthy of its own investigation? To say it's happening over here, so that's the same as it happening over there, is a clear nonsense when, on all the available evidence, it happens at much higher rates to Indigenous children. And it's not like we haven't had royal commissions into specific forms of child sexual abuse before. 10 years ago, we launched the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. That, of course, specifically investigated abuse within institutions such as churches, schools, hospitals, and how they responded to it. It didn't investigate child sexual abuse in homes or Indigenous communities. So if sexual abuse in the church was worthy of a royal commission, and it most definitely was, then why isn't sexual abuse in Indigenous communities worthy of a royal commission? To use the smear that this was political opportunism and weaponising the real suffering of Indigenous children across the country every day was despicable. Mr Dutton says he has privately counselled Ms Archer.
Well, I can have a private conversation with Bridget. As much as I love the Ray Hadley Morning Show, I shan't discuss the private conversations on air. On this issue, though, I don't understand why Bridget crossed the floor. I think it's a very significant issue for our country, as I say. I think she's made a mistake. It's the wrong decision. And most importantly, from my perspective, it takes away from the Prime Minister's culpability here.
He ought to ask her to resign from the party. After the failure of the Voice to Parliament referendum, the opposition has tried to throw the discussion forward and get some real action going on serious issues. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Ms Archer, if you disagree so much with your own party, then grow a spine and leave. Meanwhile, the federal government has today announced that it will leave the Port of Darwin in the hands of a Chinese company with reported links to the CCP. The Prime Minister last year launched a review into the 99-year lease that was given to Landbridge in 2015. The Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet put out a statement today saying there was a robust regulatory system in place to manage risks to critical infrastructure and that it was not necessary to vary or cancel the lease. Monitoring of security arrangements around the Port of Darwin will continue, it said. Australians can have confidence that their safety will not be compromised while ensuring that Australia remains a competitive destination for foreign investment. Now, let's not forget, the Port of Darwin is a major strategic asset and the only significant port in the northern half of Australia, and it's currently in the hands of China, a country that we know has taken up the fight against us with huge tariffs and trade bans in recent years, and that keeps doing security and lending deals with our Pacific neighbours. The fact we even allowed it to fall into Chinese hands in the first place is bad enough, but the Albanese government is now using this report as an excuse to cosy up to China, just a month, of course, before the PM is set to visit. Now, this report was handed to the government in June. 4 months later, on a Friday afternoon, a month before Albanese goes to China, a week after Cheng Lei returned to Australia, the same week China flags that it's getting ready to lift wine tariffs, the government decides to release the findings and leave China in charge of the Port of Darwin. Forgive me for being a little cynical here. It is the oldest trick in the book. What took them so long to release the findings and confirm they were leaving it in Chinese hands? I mean, what was wrong with any time in the last 4 months? Or was it opportune to do it now and curry favour? Mr Albanese has certainly changed his tune from 2020 when he said the Port of Darwin, quote, should never have been sold and it should never have been not in Australian hands. What's the difference now, Prime Minister? He also said the leasing of the port to a Chinese company was something I opposed as Shadow Infrastructure Minister at the time, and that it was hard to think of an Australian infrastructure asset that's more vital to our national interest than the Port of Darwin. But 3 years later, on the eve of a trip to China, and on the strength of a report he's had for 4 months, he says it's A-OK. China is growing its strength and power in our region, there's no doubt about that, and we can hardly tell our neighbours not to get into bed with China when we let them own one of our most important strategic assets. The federal government could rip up the lease tomorrow But they won't, and we all know why. Let's head to Canberra now for tonight's political headlines with Sky News political reporter Olivia Caisley.
Good evening. The Australian government won't vary or cancel a Chinese company's controversial 99-year lease over the Port of Darwin. The long-awaited review has allayed national security concerns, declaring there is a robust regulatory system in place to manage risk to critical infrastructure, including the Port of Darwin. Existing monitoring mechanisms are sufficient and will be ongoing, and as a result, it will not be necessary to vary or cancel the lease. The findings come as the Prime Minister is expected to visit Beijing next month. China was reported to be frustrated by the length of time it was taking to finalise the review. Last week, another hurdle in the relationship was overcome when Australian journalist Chung Lei was released from detention. The Prime Minister will not stop in Israel when he travels to Washington DC next week to meet with US President Joe Biden. Anthony Albanese has ruled out a Tel Aviv stopover when he travels to the United States.
I have no plans to visit the Middle East, and I have, in terms of the security agencies as well, there's no disagreement from the position that I've taken.
He'll meet with US President Joe Biden to discuss security ties and the clean energy transition. It's a direct rejection of the opposition's calls, who say the Prime Minister should be paying Israel a visit as a sign of solidarity.
To be able to stand with Israel at this time, as other world leaders have done. That should be the priority, frankly, of any international travel at the moment.
As the war rages between Hamas and Israel, both UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and US President Joe Biden have dropped in to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu.
I think it's a mistake. I mean, it wouldn't be a great detour. He could do it and not lose much time. Many other Democratic leaders, it's not just Rishi Sunak, Macron's probably going.
Closer to home, Anthony Albanese has batted away suggestions his party is split on the conflict after two of his ministers condemned Israel's blockade of Gaza.
Ed Husey, Anna Lee and my entire team voted for a resolution in the Parliament. Every loss of an innocent life matters, whether they are Israeli or Palestinian.
Well, it's been another big week. The House and Senate sat, of course. The results from last Saturday's referendum have sunk in, and the conflict between Israel and Hamas terrorists continues to heat up. There's lots to get through, so joining me now to get the latest on the news of the week is One Nation Chief of Staff James Ashby and Radio 2GB host Luke Grant. Gents, welcome. Now, there's a Sydney mosque that's planning to commemorate the deaths of 3 Hezbollah fighters killed by the Israeli army tomorrow. The Al Rahman Mosque, it's called, in the southwest Sydney suburb of Kingsgrove, is going to hold this service. And according to Hezbollah, one of the men who will be commemorated was, quote unquote, martyred as a result of the Zionist aggression on South Lebanon. Now, as you can expect, James, this has got the shackles up for people in the Jewish community. I mean, how ridiculous to think that anyone, I ask this question all the time, surely if you come to Australia because you think it's better than the place you came from. Why would any mosque or any other outfit for that matter think it was a good idea to celebrate terrorists in Australia?
I'm glad you put that into a little bit of perspective there, Caleb. The truth is, these people are terrorists. And if we want to put it into better perspective for people across Australia that are watching right now, if you can imagine, 9 years ago, Sydney went through a horrific terrorism attack at the Link Cafe there in the heart of the city. And if you remember rightly, it was Madman Monis that killed 2 Aussies. That was almost 9 years ago. We're talking about the same treatment of these Hezbollah fighters, terrorists, and giving them some big celebration send-off party off to Mecca or wherever they're sending them to. The reality of it is, this is just appalling. Most Sydney-siders should just be horrified at this idea, and no wonder Islam has an identity issue or going through a crisis here in Australia. No wonder Australians fear Islam to some degree, because this is what they promote. Not peace, but terrorism. And not all Islamic followers do that, but far too many in this country do. And we need to put a stop to this. I hope some of those imams wake up to themselves and say, we are no longer going through.
And that's it. I mean, it's if you're an imam, you have a responsibility to your community to lead them in the right direction, Luke. And I didn't see a lot of condemnation from mosques after you saw those scenes on the streets of Sydney last Monday at the front of the Opera House, gas the Jews and all the other foul things that they said. Anyone who rocks up to this service on the weekend ought to be put on an ASIO watch list, surely.
Well, look, it's about reading the room, isn't it? I mean, it is initially, and I agree with what James said. It's about decency. It's about, you know, in this country, we give you all the opportunities, we love it. And that's not to say that the vast majority of people who attend this, if there are people attending it, won't be Australian-born. But please leave your rubbish at the door. Don't bring it in with you. And fresh in the mind of Sydney-siders, it's not that obvious to point out, as you said, Caleb, it's people holding up Free Palestine signs and others saying, F the Jews, gas the Jews. Hello? And are they going to have a complete set? Why not invite down a couple of Bali bombers while you're at it? I mean, it's just wrong on every bloody level. Yeah, it's frankly disgusting. Hopefully they don't get too much of a crowd there. But as I say, anyone who does turn up ought to be watched. Now, Trade Minister Don Farrell's in a bit of hot water today after he appointed his former union ally and ex-Senator Chris Ketter as Australia's Consul General and Trade and Investment Commissioner to San Francisco. And the problem here, James, is that it pushed out a highly qualified public servant who had been recommended for this role, was considered the right man for the job. But, of course, you know, jobs for the boys. We'll send one of our Labor and union mates over there. Remember what happened in New South Wales when John Barilaro was mooted to go over to New York? All hell broke loose. But, well, when Labor does it, it's just business as usual.
Who says you can't get a good job with an arts degree, Caleb? Look, Chris Ketter does have an arts degree, but the reality was it would have been a good idea if they were handing out a degree of personality. This bloke lacks a great deal of personality. I know him personally. He's a nice fella, but he's better suited to a librarian role than this consulate general role over in the United States. Look, this role requires trying to sell Australia, sell Australian products to the globe, but more importantly to America. I don't think he's fit for the role. You're right, this is jobs for the boys. This is what Australians hate. They hate politicians who give their mates jobs. This bloke only served one term in the Australian Senate. So he did, I think, close to 6 years. He wasn't re-elected. You know, he was the runt of the litter when it came to that election. He should have been turfed out, done with. But instead, he gets a cushy job in the United States. Good job, Chris. Well done.
I mean, I know everyone does it, Luke, but, you know, fair shake, or fair suck, as Kevin Rudd would say.
Yes, exactly right. What a joke. I mean, please, a bit of perspective, viewers. Labor weren't ScoMo, right? They were all going to hold hoses and they were going to fix up everything. There was going to be an Anti-Corruption Commission, right? So in New South Wales, we've got a minister who appoints someone that went to her wedding as chief of secretary of her department, a friend, and they punt a woman, highly qualified. Now this bloke, and by the way, if you're a librarian, just for your information, James, the New South Wales police minister comes to that role as a librarian. All she can do is throw the book at people, and she's not very good at doing that, I can tell you. But this just absolutely, boom, boom, this absolutely stinks. I mean, this is absolutely rotten. I know we've got a good lady there, but my mate wants the job. I mean, is that not misogynistic? It would be if Abbott did it. Bloody hell, what a joke.
Very good point. Very good point, Luke. Now, James, Adam Band, of course, has been unrepentant after Greens MPs wrongly blamed Israel for that blast which killed hundreds of Palestinians at that hospital in Gaza late on Tuesday. So he's now said, oh, well, you know, Israel, they changed their story over who's responsible because it was initially blamed on Hamas and then it was the Islamic Jihad. I mean, pull the other one, mate. They got it wrong.
Yeah, they sure did. But look, the Greens for this last week have quite literally used the Australian Parliament to warmonger for the Palestinians. And I hate every ounce of what the Greens stand for in our parliament, both in the Senate and the lower house. It sends a very, very wrong message to the rest of the world, particularly those people in Israel who copped that terrorism attack only 2 weeks ago. And to see them sit there with their smug looks on their face, with Palestinian apparel around their necks, and then to hear these words is atrocious. Australians should condemn the Greens at every which way they possibly can. There is nothing that can save the Greens at the next federal election. As far as I'm concerned, Australia really needs to take a good look at this National Greens Party. They're not about saving koalas, I can tell you that right now. They're about mass importation of migrants, and they're about warmongering for these pro-terrorist groups, and that's all I'll say about them. It's not a good look.
Green on the outside, terrorist on the inside. How good. Now, Luke, before we go, Queensland's Labor Premier, of course, Anastasia Palaszczuk, said today that she's no longer going to be supporting her treaty legislation. Obviously, Queensland, very roundly rejected the voice to Parliament, but they have lost bipartisan support. And so she's now saying, well, without bipartisan support, there's no way this thing can work. I mean, A, hallelujah, but B, amazing it took her this long to realise it was a dud policy.
You know what? She has been absolutely lapped by David Crisafulli, and he took a while to do it. I don't want to be, glowing in my praise of him. Of course, on Sunday he said, a path to treaty should continue in Queensland. Then he gets to Wednesday into Thursday and says, you know what? 70% of Queenslanders said, nah. In fact, as Paul Murray would say, they said, hell no. 30% didn't. I think there's a message there. And I think it's a pretty smart politician that says it's okay to change your mind if you know what the people think. So Crisafulli went on Wednesday, Thursday. That gave Anastasia nowhere to go. She had to do it. I think it's the most lame of excuses. Oh, we can't get bipartisan support. The biggest surprise was that, as addicted as she is to red carpets, she didn't make that announcement on a red carpet. But somewhat predictable.
Well, you thank Pauline Hanson for putting the pressure on there.
You say, Luke, Palaszczuk's been left...
Did I mention Pauline Hanson?
We have now. You say Palaszczuk's been left with nowhere to go, but maybe when she's finished being Premier, she's got a nice cushy job overseas to go to. James Ashby and Luke Grant, thank you so much for joining me. Well, coming up, we'll get the latest on the economy as the cost of living continues to rise, while our political establishment appears caught up with slashing emissions and playing racial politics, of course. Plus, we'll get the latest on the Israel-Hamas conflict that continues to heat up. Welcome back. Caleb Bond in for Credlin. Well, coming up, concerning figures released this week show that Australia's birth rate is declining as mothers choose to have children later on in life. But first, as I mentioned earlier in the show, the federal government has today confirmed that the Port of Darwin, the only major port in the country's north and a significant strategic asset, is going to remain in the hands of a Chinese company with links to the CCP. Joining me now is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Michael Shoebridge. Michael, welcome. This report was produced by the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet and handed to the federal government 4 months ago. Why have they made this announcement today?
Well, Caleb, I'm with Strategic Analysis Australia now, but I think this review was deliberately on the go slow, because even though the government could have been pretty confident PM&C were going to recommend no change because of the way the review was set up, there was still a little bit of doubt. So just putting it off and slow rolling it made a lot of sense. And putting it out now after Cheng Lei has been released sends a signal to Beijing that everything's looking good for that magic handshake moment between Prime Minister Albanese and Xi Jinping.
And congratulations on your move to Strategic Analysis Australia, by the way. It strikes me as odd that the Prime Minister, before he was Prime Minister 3 years ago, was talking very clearly about the fact that he thought this was an asset that should never have left Australian hands. It's an important strategic asset that we should have held on to. And then, of course, for political reasons, further down the line, he says, "Oh, well, it's okay. We'll leave it in the hands of the Chinese." It is the only port, as I said, in the northern half of Australia. Why would we not just rip up this lease and bring it back into Australian hands, apart from political reasons?
Well, Caleb, I think you put your finger on it. It's our deepwater port in our north. It's the focus of Australian and US military activity. There's massive investment from the Americans into our north, including in Darwin. They built a $200 million fuel facility for their aircraft. And this port that's operated by this Chinese company is in the best piece of real estate on the best part of the harbour. It's getting in the way of this military corporation that's becoming more important.
And just explain the importance of the Port of Darwin as an asset. How much comes in, how much goes out? What is the value of it to us?
Well, it's the main port. Actually, as a commercial port, it's been a loss-making endeavour for this Chinese company. And you've got to wonder, why do they want to keep losing money on this commercial port? Most of the military stuff is routed around that port. It's going to other developments in Darwin Harbour, which are far less useful. To get a decent-sized, even the offshore patrol vessels, into another part of Darwin Harbour, you've got to do dredging and use explosives to deepen the harbour. So they're sitting on the best piece of real estate and they're stopping us using it for our security.
Funny about that. Meanwhile, we've seen both US President Joe Biden and the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak go over to Israel this week. Obviously, it was post that blast near a hospital in Gaza. Now, when it came to that blast, Hamas immediately blamed Israel, but the evidence is pretty clear that it was actually a misfired rocket from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But that didn't seem to stop many news outlets jumping to swallow the Hamas propaganda. And one of the results of that was that the summit that Biden was meant to have with leaders in the Middle East fell over. Just how important and what were the ramifications of that misinformation that was spread by Hamas?
Well, Caleb, you're right. It was very effective misinformation, and it played into a whole lot of prejudices where people want to walk politely past the mass murders by the Hamas terrorists inside Israel and scrutinise Israel for operating in ways that any military should be proud of. So the bigger effect is really to slow down the other Middle Eastern countries' acknowledgement that the big threat they all face is Iran. But really that realisation will dawn on them. And the Hamas terrorist attacks only make that more obvious because they are an Iranian-sponsored group.
Indeed, and we know that a lot of Iranian money has come from the US, funnily enough. So the cycle goes round and round and round. Michael Shoebridge, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Caleb.
Well, I want to talk about the economy now because, of course, anybody who lives outside the Canberra bubble knows it's the most important issue out there. Cost of living and cost of living. And we saw this week that inflation is still elevated, and in 2 weeks, of course, the Reserve Bank has the option to hike interest rates again. You've got power prices and food prices, fuel prices are all still quite high, and mortgage stress is sky high. Businesses are collapsing at rates we haven't seen in decades. Well, to get across all the movements of the week and what we're likely to see in a couple of weeks' time, joining me now is Chief Economist at Macro Business, Leith Van Onselen. Leith, welcome. Unemployment this week dropped to 3.6%, which has brought forward concerns that it will help worsen inflation. You've got oil prices rising, but the market's predicting about a 25% chance of a rate hike on Melbourne Cup Day. I see today Terry McCrann writing in the Herald Sun that he thinks it's unlikely there would be another interest rate hike. But, you know, you've got another 6,700 jobs have been added in the month. It was lower than expected. But you've got the Treasurer walking around trumpeting, it's great, we've got unemployment this low, but we have been told that the unemployment rate will play a large part in decisions as to whether interest rates, increase or not.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the headline unemployment rate fell by 0.1%, right, to 3.6%. Now, that sounds great on the surface. The problem with it is, as you said, we only created 6,600 jobs. Now, because the population has grown so strongly, we actually need to create about 35,000 jobs per month just to keep the unemployment rate constant. Now, the reason why it fell was actually a bit of a statistical quirk. It's because we had a whole bunch of people actually drop out of the labour market. So that sort of gave it this sort of false dawn. And if you actually look at a lot of other sort of labour market measures, whether they be Roy Morgan's alternative unemployment measure or the SEEK job ads and SEEK applications per job ad data, that's all softened quite significantly over the past few months. So I think the labour market is actually weakening. I don't think it's yesterday's results going to play a part in the interest rate decision. The thing that will tilt the dial one way or another will be next week's September quarter CPI release. So economists are tipping that CPI will come in at around 1%. And if it comes in around 1% or below, I think the RBA will keep rates on hold. But if it comes in above that, they very well might hike. And it's interesting, the Reserve Bank actually threw a bit of a curveball at economists and markets this week when it released its monetary policy minutes. And what it said that it's concerned about two things which could force its hand. And that's effectively that we've got this rapid growth in rents and also we've got this house price rebound, both of which have been caused by the Albanese government's mass immigration, the record immigration flows. So effectively we've got the Albanese government basically, pumping the foot on the gas, inducing demand by bringing in all these people. That's 626,000 population increase in last financial year. And what that's effectively doing is it's counteracting the Reserve Bank's rate hikes. It's working against the Reserve Bank to slow demand. And what it could mean is the Reserve Bank actually keeps rates higher for longer or is forced to hike again to counteract this stimulus coming from, this record immigration from the Albanese government.
And we've talked about this many times before, Leith, and of course the other major contributor at the moment is the cost of fuel. I mean, transport costs have gone up something like 17%, and the majority of that is accounted for in fuel. And Paul Murray, I know, talks about this all the time. I mean, the federal government tomorrow could have the fuel excise. I mean, they get about 49 cents in the dollar out of fuel. They could reduce the cost of fuel tomorrow. But what do you think is the likelihood of another interest rate rise either before the end of the year or early next year?
Look, if you'd asked me this a couple of weeks ago, I would have said minimal, because we've got obviously the weakening economy and we're in a per capita recession, all that sort of stuff. But obviously the rising petrol prices thrown a bit of a curveball, as has the Reserve Bank's minutes, which basically was more hawkish, which means it's more bullish on interest rates than inflation than what everyone thought. Look, I'd say, Terry McCrann's probably about right. It probably is about 25% increase for another rate hike, maybe 50% chance. Again, it all tilts on what happens with with inflation next week, and then also wage growth, which will come out the next month. So basically, the Reserve Bank, I think, is doing the right thing. It is looking at the data, and it says if it comes in stronger than we expect, we'll hike. But if it doesn't, we'll keep rates on hold. So, I mean, I'm obviously sitting on the fence because I honestly don't know. It all depends on the data.
Well, the Reserve Bank seems to be in a bit of a pickle itself at the moment because they've posted a record $43 billion loss, which has pushed its balance sheet deeper into negative equity of almost $18 billion. And this obviously comes after the RBA's huge pandemic stimulus. And you've now got economists calling on the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, to inject some $30 billion of emergency capital into the bank. Exactly how serious is this?
Look, I mean, obviously they've taken a punt, but it sort of reminds me a little bit of Monopoly. I mean, the bank always wins, right? So, Reserve Bank is the bank, and it's a bit sort of weird. It's it wants this emergency money pumped in when it can basically print money. It creates money. So, look, the whole thing's just it looks like it's a bet on the markets that's gone wrong. I'm sure the federal government will end up doing what it needs, to keep it, so-called solvent. But look, the thing I'm more concerned about, and this, I'm sorry to tilt this on you, but it's actually the fact that the Reserve Bank governor has just received a 100,000 plus pay rise. I think that's a bit egregious when, given the Reserve Bank is the one telling everyone that we've got to keep a lid on inflation to keep a lid on wage growth to hold inflation back, when it's just awarded itself a 10% pay rise to the governor. That to me is the far bigger issue. And, I think that's pretty egregious. We're in this cost of living crisis and it's, sitting there awarding its top brass huge pay rises.
Yeah, I mean, how do you sell it to people? I mean, Philip Lowe made about $1 million in his last year, and he was going around telling us, the interest rates aren't going to go up, go and borrow money, and we all know what happened there. And he, of course, had access to that scheme in his early days at the Reserve Bank, where he basically got a half-price interest rate on his mortgage, so he benefited out of that. And then what is it now? The average person sitting on the Reserve Bank board is making around $80K a year. Is that right?
No. I mean, the amount of money that people get paid at Reserve Bank's astronomical. As they got loads of people getting paid over 200 grand, and then heaps getting paid over 400 as well.
But board members, though, what's a board member making?
Actually, look, to be honest with you, I'm not sure. I can't tell you that because I don't know. But I'm sure they're on a good wicket, because everyone at the Reserve Bank's on a good wicket, especially if you're at that top upper echelon. And to be fair, this isn't just a problem across the Reserve Bank. We've got the head of the National Broadband Network getting paid $3 million a year. We've got all the university vice chancellors getting paid over $1 million. So we've got this kind of problem where we've got this greedflation going on if you're one of the top people in these quasi-government organisations. Whilst ordinary punters are basically doing it tough. And, this has been a problem with CEO pay in general, but it's really infected our public service and quasi-government bodies. I mean, I put universities in that bucket because they're basically funded by taxpayers. And, it's right across the spectrum, where the head of the Australia Post, National Broadband Network, Reserve Bank, universities, you name it. They're all getting paid way too much. And their pay rises just don't reflect, their productivity and their value, in my opinion.
Well, if anyone else can let me know if they've had a 10% pay rise, I'd love to hear it. Leith Van Onselen, thank you for your time.
No worries. Anytime, Caleb.
Well, coming up after the break, Queensland public servants have been offered 5 days special paid leave for psychological distress if they're grieving about Saturday's no result, plus dogs in the workplace. Is it a good idea? I don't seem to think so, but one of our panellists up next, Christy McSweeney, does. We'll see her dog at work. Amazon's doing it now too. Welcome back, Caleb Bond in for Credlin. Well, coming up, you've seen plain packaging and gruesome photos on cigarettes. Now, wine could be next, as if the alcohol excise wasn't enough already. But first, let's go to our first panel for tonight. We're joined by Sky News contributor Tina McQueen and the founder of the PR Council, Christy McSweeney. Ladies, welcome to the show. Here I am once again, the thorn between the roses, but I'm more than happy to fill that role. Now, Queensland public servants, as I was just mentioned before, they've been offered 5 days special paid leave for psychological distress if they're grieving the outcome of the failed Voice to Parliament referendum. I mean, Tina, the banks have done it now, the big banks. Yep. Melbourne Uni offered it even before the results of the referendum had come through. Are people really that snowflakey that the result of a democratic vote is going to send you into such an apoplectic fit that you need to have 5 days off?
Well, you should see what PwC sent out, offering all sorts of counselling services for their workers. I don't mind if the yes had got up, had it been successful, that we would have been given the same, privileges, that's fine. It doesn't bother me as long as it's for both sides, Caleb.
I
can assure you, if the result had been the other way, there would have been a lot of us that would have been very close to slitting our throats.
Well, were you going to take a week off, Christy, if the yes result got up? Just go and drown your sorrows on a nice beach somewhere?
No, but I'll feel better about the direction that Victoria is going in, given that it popped over the line at just over 50% as well. So the vote has restored my faith in the state of Victoria after quite a long time now. But look, I'm a policy person. As you know, I've spent years and years doing industrial relations. So the first thing I looked at was the Queensland Employment Code, the Industrial Relations Act of Queensland, 2016, which lists out a number of leave entitlements that Queensland Queensland public servants are entitled to. Cultural leave is among them, as well as all the standard ones. Leave for having to implement public policy that you don't agree with under the Queensland Public Service Code of Conduct does not rate a mention. 69% of Queenslanders voted no. We know the job of public servants in all public service code of conducts around the country is to implement government policy as elected by the democratic will of the people. And this not only is charging Queensland taxpayers to fund leave entitlements that 69% of them voted against, it is a bit at odds with the Public Service Code of Conduct.
Well, I'm going to go up to Queensland because
it'll actually be more than 69% because they're doing pre-poll and postals, and it'll always go to us. So it's going to be, the other side's going to have a 3 in front of it.
I'm going to go up to Queensland. It's nice and sunny, and I can get as much leave as I want because, as you all know at home, I was a yes voter. Don't tell anyone. Randwick Council in Sydney's eastern suburbs is holding a meeting about whether or not it should fly a Palestinian flag on November 29, which is the United Nations International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. I mean, why is it even a question, Tina? Right now, why would you be putting up the Palestinian flag?
Yeah, and a council in the eastern suburbs where a majority of the Jewish population is, this council has form. Caleb, it's previously dealt with Palestinian issues, which is none of their business. So keep the rates down and stay in your lane. It's absolutely disgraceful. And I think the federal government or the state government should step in and stop it if they attempt to do that.
Who would have thought, eh? Now, new data from the ABS has revealed that women in Australia are having fewer children and giving birth later in life. So 1975, less than 20% of births were to mothers aged between 30 and 39 years. Now 60% of mothers are in this age group, and in 75 the fertility rate was 2.15. Now it's 1.63. And Christy, I think the biggest concern here, of course, is that if we don't have more children being born in this country, the only alternative you have is to import them, whether they're already grown or whether you import them as children. But one of the main drivers of all of this is we don't make it easy anymore for someone to have a family. Like, it's sure the women are giving birth to these kids later, but these are decisions that couples are making because the economic conditions are not conducive to them having kids earlier.
Yes, and I noticed a demographer said career-focused women having children later and later and later. Well, perhaps they're not so career-focused as the fact that they just want to live in a house.
Correct.
That's first of all, that's very gendered language for a demographer to use. Second of all, that is the reason people want to bring up their children in good economic circumstances and provide for them, and that is a good thing.
Yeah, indeed. I just wish we would make it easier. I remember John Howard once said, good economic policy serves the people, and that's exactly how it should be.
And also, Caleb, if women want to choose and stay home with the children, they do have it. There's no incentive for them to do that. 100%. It's absolutely disgraceful that everyone else is encouraged to, but not stay at home.
All this money we give to childcare subsidy, but if you want to stay at home, no encouragement at all. Now, before we go, 10,000 dogs are registered to go to work with their owners at Amazon's head office in Seattle. Now, that's a ratio of about 1 dog to every 5 employees, and the company says it's making employees happier, and they're planning on rolling this out across their Australian offices as well. Now, Christy, I believe we have a photograph of your dog at work. Roll the tape. Here he is. He looks like he's having a whale of a time there. I'm assuming you're on board with this, are you?
Well, I fall into the bracket of women who didn't have children, Caleb, and so I have little Maggie there, the Shih Tzu Chihuahua, who I do bring to work. I'm with Amazon. Of course, I run a small business and I am able to do that. I'm not sure about bringing your dog to work in a corporate environment.
That's not even a real dog. A Shih Tzu what?
Oh,
that's not a real dog. That's like a little rat.
It is too.
I am not a lover of dogs, and I think it's ridiculous.
I've got a couple of cats, but we've only got 10 seconds, Tina, but I reckon that would give me the Shih Tzus if they had dogs in the office here. Don't know how I can get around.
No dogs.
Thank you. Tina McQueen, Christy McSweety, thank you for your time. All right, coming up, the latest plan by the Albanese government to hurt business. This time it involves forcing alcohol producers to print labels on their bottles, warning consumers about the risk of drinking, as though you didn't already know. Talk about a nanny state. Welcome back, Caleb Bond in for Credlin. Well, organisations including the AMA and the RACGP are calling for alcohol producers to be forced to print labels on bottles, cans and casks, warning of the risk of liver disease, cancer, heart disease, poor mental health, injury, alcohol poisoning, on and on it goes. And the government's taking their demands seriously. The Federal Minister responsible for food and beverage labelling, Jed Kearney, says she sought advice from her department on options for raising consumer awareness about the harms associated with alcohol. I mean, can't I just enjoy my bottle of red in peace tonight? Joining me to discuss this is Adele Young, the Executive Director of Alcohol Beverages Australia. Adele, welcome. I mean, what's next? Plain packaging for wine? Gruesome photos of liver cirrhosis? Seriously?
Well, let's hope not, because there simply, in our view, isn't any justification for cancer warnings. We've worked for some time with industry over labelling changes to have pregnancy warnings and now energy warnings or calorie, details. And we think there are positive things that need to continue. But in Australia, consumption for alcohol is going down dramatically and has been for a long time. And also so's the rate of harmful drinking. It simply can't be justified that you would, by any measure, that this is, that this is needed. And it would be very harmful to the small brewers and the small distillers and the small businesses and wineries. I think we can rely on the National Alcohol Strategy and the weekly guidelines, and people are making better choices about their own alcohol consumption, and we should continue to respect that choice. We're happy to work, on the things that can make a difference, but this just isn't one of those suggestions. So we'll be working hard to convince the government to reject these suggestions.
Well, I mean, it sort of treats us like children, doesn't it? Like anyone who has a glass of wine or a beer or, the potential risks involved. It's not like drinking was invented yesterday. We understand the risks. And yes, there are people out there who are alcoholics and suffer from addiction and therefore suffer from health problems as a result of that. But are you telling me, or you're not telling me, but really, an alcoholic's not going to go down to the bottle-o one day and go, oh my God, there's a warning on the front, I better give up being an alcoholic. It's an addiction. It's the same as smoking. Unless there's something that really stops you, like you're in trouble and the doctor tells you have to stop or you're going to die, or they tax it into oblivion, which they're trying their best to do, these warnings, it's just paternalistic nonsense.
Well, our position has been, we drink 30% less than we did in the 70s at its peak, and we are certainly drinking better quality alcohol and less of it. So, we absolutely agree that young people, risky drinking, as in too much, should be discouraged, and we should support people who do have a problem. That small percentage of the community who do suffer harm from alcohol products, that's where the effort needs to be, not just broad scale, non-proven, non-effective, shoot from the hip ideas that simply don't have any evidence to support that they will work. And as you say, it's probably not going to do anything for that section of the community that we are concerned about.
Indeed. We've only got 30 seconds here, Adele, but the excise we know recently went up. How much pressure is this putting on particularly small producers?
Well, the industry's come through a very tough period and is quite resilient. But when consumers are saying, it's $10 for a beer or a drink down at the pub, it's certainly making on top of your prices of your electricity and petrol much, much harder to make ends meet. And it's one of the discretionary things that families have to give up. And that's a real shame for the 500,000 people who work in this industry, but also for citizens.
Yeah, I know. And the alcohol industry, the wine industry in particular for Australia and my home state of South Australia is a huge money spinner. It's a major part of the economy. It's a major part of tourism. The exports it generates are huge. And, of course, we're now talking about getting China back online in terms of our wine exports. So let's hope we don't have to deal with more of this nonsense. Adele, thank you so much for your time. And thank you so much for your company tonight as well. It's been a pleasure to be here here for Credlin. She'll be back at 6 p.m. on Monday, and then I'll be in the chair at 7 p.m. on Monday for Andrew Bolt. Plenty of good racing on tomorrow. Watch the Caulfield Cup, have some fun. Rita Panahi's up next.